Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. All right, welcome back, everybody, to have watched our previous episodes or listened to them. And to anybody who's new to the podcast, we've basically been talking about themes, worldview related between the Rings of Power and Tolkien's books on Middle-earth. Today we're doing something a little different than what we've done in the past. We are going to be talking a little bit more on the popularity of the show and why, for various reasons, not just necessarily Tolkien related, but also quality of the show and how, maybe why people want to be watching it as much. Anyway, I guess I'd like to give a little bit of a background to some of the things that have happened with the show ever since the release. So first off, Amazon won the rights from the Tolkien estate to do a Lord of the Rings show. And after that, also, Jeff Bezos, who was the CEO at that time, was trying to go for a show that could compete with Game of Thrones. And for a lot of people, that was just kind of like a red flag about sex and nudity. And also a lot of Tolkien fans, got up in arms and protested. A lot of petitions were actually created, and so yeah, it became a pretty big thing. I created a petition also. Over the years, though, it did until basically I'd say to 6 months before the show came out, it became pretty clear that the sex and nudity wasn't going to appear, and everyone was, I guess, a little at rest about that. And it was something also the producers assured people of, so they were good on their word on that. I think something that was pretty, in a way, significant is there was this. So the trailer came out time of the Super Bowl of last year, so that would have been in 2022, I guess. And there was this group that Amazon put together to watch the show. They called them the Super Fans. If you go back and watch that the Supervan video or check out any of the comments that people have given on that group, basically it wasn't as if Amazon put together that group to really portray what they were trying to do with the show very well, in terms of trying to make it true to Tolkien. They were basically seeming okay, so they have these super fans out here, kind of seems like they're kind of going for a woke agenda in a way, because some of them seem to be from a LGBTQ group of some sort in a lot of ways. So and what they were talking about, they're asked some questions simply about who is Sauron, or basic questions like that they kind of gave more of a joking answer than actually being serious about this is yeah, we actually know the Middle Earth story pretty well. So it seemed more like we're oh yeah, we're here to kind of give representation for anything that's woke, but if it the things about Tolkien don't necessarily matter so much as long as we're getting the woke message across. So I think for a lot of people that was a big red flag. To probably a lot of fans, it was a bigger red flag than the whole sex and nudity thing, actually, because for the way I see it, it changes the worldview of how you approach Lord of the Rings in a lot of ways. So then just going into the show, I was kind of surprised that a lot of these things weren't as upfront. You have Galadriel as a female kind of kick butt leader who is going out there showing everybody that she can do it all, and you're gonna be following her, and I mean, yes, they have black people playing different roles, but that wasn't like so sticking out to me as it would to some other fans though who are really thinking about the medieval era of Lord of the Rings and how that was tied to a lot of like Tolkien's reasons for like writing off of like Norse mythology and whatnot, and so Caucasians would work better instead of black people for those characters. But so yeah, so I guess I didn't think about how much like Amazon really focused on everything else until like really seeing how like the direction that they were taking things could be alienating Middle Earth fans in a lot of ways. So they came out with the stat that 37% of the viewers of the Rings of Power show did not finish the first season. So I thought, oh, this would be interesting to see basically how, like, is that 30% like mixed with people who are fans and who like really aren't big fans, or is that just, you know, oh, it's like, oh, well, there are a ton of people out there who aren't fans, so they might have watched some of it but they didn't finish it. Um, so I was like curious with that and trying to figure out some more about how at least fans if they thought the show was worth watching. So just based off of that stat, I tried to figure out through a poll whether people like the show for reasons of rewatching episodes or wanting to watch the second season or even recommending it to a friend. And I gave them just like three different options of yes, basically I did like it, I would recommend it to a friend, or no, I wouldn't, I didn't like it, or the third option was I didn't watch it because I didn't think it was worth my time. What was interesting in the poll is I'm still like collecting data on it, so this isn't finalized. So out of like 81 respondents, there were 52% who said that yes, they would recommend it, slash they liked it. And then there were like probably about 30 or so percent saying they would not recommend it and they didn't like it. And then another like 10 or so percent saying that they didn't watch it at all because it wasn't worth watching. Yeah, so it's like Mark, I think that we talked about like at the end of the first season the grade we'd give it, basically like A, B, whatever it was. So I know for me I gave it a B plus at first. Later on I thought about it more. I'm like, yeah, I'd probably give it like a B rating just at that. But would you say that like was there like a woke message in the show that affected your rating of the Rings of Power? Or was it not until like, oh, now hearing more about like things that have been happening in the background do I like see that Amazon's more trying to push more of a woke kind of marketing agenda?
Yeah, I feel like it's hard for me because I think what is or is not woke can be sort of up to different people's definitions. I think the portrayal of Galadriel as very much a strong female martial arts character who seemed to have a lot of very masculine traits, which feel very absent in the books. That definitely lowered my rating of the show. And if that you consider that to be woke, then I think that's like a fair assessment that like yeah, the woke element of the show lowered my rating. I think honestly though, like and we've been having this discussion of like it feels like maybe they struggled to just tell a good story, right, using Tolkien's work. Maybe it wasn't just about some specific elements. But maybe it's just like the show wasn't that good in general, and not because it was trying to push some agenda, but like because it just didn't tell as great a story as the books do. But yeah,
That's definitely something that I guess thinking back about how like why wouldn't this show have been like an A level show, I think a lot of people may have like kind of like wondered about that, in a lot of ways, especially if they didn't see a lot of these cast interviews, where the girl who plays Disa, like they're
Mm-hmm.
asking her, "Hey, how do you feel like about being the first like black female dwarf?" And that being kind of like the big question they're asking instead of it being any question on like trying to like make a character that's Lord of the Rings, Tolkien related or something like that. So, anyways, so it kind of like seemed more clear to me looking back on it now, saying, okay, like only 37% of the people finished this. They seem to be making, trying to push a woke marketing agenda, you know, and maybe that was more of their focus than trying to create a show that was true to Tolkien. And another thing that also got on my mind about this as well is that there's also a certain point where if there is a woke agenda, like how much is that going to clash with Tolkien's Christian perspective on things? And how much are they not going to be as closely tied to it as maybe you people would have liked to see?
Yeah, those are, I think, really good questions. And I think that's right. I think it's important to say, like, the problem with the show wasn't that they, like, focused on, like, hey, we're the first black dwarf or the first black elf, um, or anything like that. The problem was that, like, they focused on that. It seems like over trying to tell a good story. And if you think about like, the story, I think, like, the real things that bothered me were, like, well, Galadriel's portrayal, but, like, also not having Sauron coming until the end, having him be like a surprise villain, the whole thing with like Mithril being destroying the elves, right? Like, these are things that are just like, oh, we're just like throwing this in, we're like making up as we go along, and so that was, I think, the story was the real problem of the show, and if wokeness is the problem, it's because it drew more focus than other parts of the story should have. But yeah, I think it's hard for me because I this definition of like wokeness is like sort of a tricky one. But I think they're definitely like Tolkien's stories are timeless. You know, he based a lot of his stories off of even older like myths, and there's this like classic feel to Tolkien's like original works. There's just this timeless element that you feel like, hey, this story could have been told 1,000 years ago. It could be told 1,000 years in the future, and it would still be a great story that everyone would enjoy. It just has these timeless themes of like friendship, and this like evil force and good is in the world, and there's something about the world that it captures in it, some deep truths. And I think that the Rings of Power feels like a very modern show and seems to get away from a lot of the themes of Tolkien, and especially I think like the character of Galadriel, but also Halbrand, where there's a lot of this internal struggle of am I good or am I bad, and just a lot of sort of confusion of the lines, where like Adar is like, he's bad in some respects, but he's really loyal to his orc brethren, and he also hates Sauron. Yeah, I guess there's just a lot of things in this show that seemed like it was very much like, oh, this is a product of our time, and like, you know, um, late or early 21st century, and like this is like clearly like dated, right? Like it's got like a stamp on it of like a lot of the ideas that are running around, and yeah, I guess like that was sort of like, oh, this is something that feels very not like Tolkien stories, because Tolkien stories are sort of that timeless and classic feel to them.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And going off of that, so it's kind of in a way that they're trying to express something in the show in a way that like about like what we're talking about or dealing with today, and something that a lot of people are, I mean, I think it's probably big in media and Hollywood for to advocate for a woke storytelling of some sort, because that they think that's what's going to get attention. So to have like a fantasy set, storyline that's in some way supposed to be like, you know at least just like years and years and years, before us, and completely, and just set in a different time, different place, so try to use things from our experiences entirely in a way, over just that storytelling itself. I think is gonna make it a it's gonna be a tough sell, I guess. to fit
Yeah.
those two things together.
I think also, and this is maybe the biggest thing that I sort of picked up on whenever I was watching the show. I picked up on it like right away, and like it's something that conflicts very much with the Tolkien story. And if you want to call this woke, but it's certainly like very modern. But it talked about like this is like pretty controversial, obviously, but like the way the different races in Middle Earth relate to each other in the show is very different than in Tolkien's stories. Particularly, there's lots of these lines of you think of the Southlands where the elves are sort of, domineering in some senses over the Southlands. And, they've had this really bad past history because these people served, Morgoth and Sauron. And there's this big, like, discussion between, the elf captain and what's the elf's name? Arondir, as well about like, right, why do we hate them? We hate them because of who they are and stuff, and also Galadriel, and how there's this big fear of her as an elf, but also she's not recognized as an elf, and she just covers her ears. So this idea that like the races are the same except for their past histories, and some conflicts that have happened in the past, and obviously that translates very easily to our own world, and a lot of sort of maybe race consciousness or identity politics and stuff like that of like what has happened in the past and how is it affecting us today. But it's really clear in Tolkien's stories that there's a lot more going on there between the different races. That dwarves, elves, and men are all very different kinds of beings. That elves and dwarves have some magic to them. That men also have their own qualities. And that whenever there's friendships or relationships across these like racial boundaries, they're not just overcoming past hatreds or conflicts and stuff like that, but also something that's very real and tangible about their own natures. I think that was like something that just stood out as like a really interesting thing, especially because if you watch some of the interviews with the creators behind the show, they talk about, oh, like Tolkien's main driving theme is like friendship among people of different races or whatever, cross racial or cross cultural relationships. And they clearly push that very hard in the show. You think of, the Southlands, Arondir, and Bronwyn, and then you have Durin and Elrond, and you also have Galadriel and Halbrand, and Galadriel and Elendil as well, and so I think it's like, oh, but they pushed it in a very different kind of way than Tolkien talks about. And other Tolkien's like work doesn't include like this idea of like overcoming past hatreds, but it's also like this deeper concept that I think they really miss out on in the show. So I was going to ask, do you think that you said that we've talked a lot of this like 37% number, right? 37% of people finish the show. And I wanted to talk about it on the podcast. Like, do you think that this was mostly like that 37%? Do you think they're mostly fans of Tolkien's works previously and then they started watching the show and they committed to finishing it? Or do you think that's like a lot of people who didn't enjoy, like have never enjoyed Tolkien's work and they're just like watching a show for the first time? And that's sort of my question, because I think it's really interesting. Like, I think we've talked a lot on the show, but like, do the themes of Tolkien's books match up with the themes of the show? Um, and if the answer to that is like no, then you think a lot of fans would have been turned off. But if like the answer is like, oh, they have, then you think that it would be a lot of fans. But I think especially like if you were to argue like, hey, we weren't faithful to the books because we wanted to make this available to a wider audience. If they failed to make it available to a wider audience by making a show that just isn't that good, then like they didn't also accomplish their goal of like, right, it made changing the books sort of pointless in some respects.
I mean, obviously, it's kind of tough to know unless you like would like take another poll and just say, "Hey, did you watch?" Like, just try to focus in on fans who are, you know, Tolkien fans, Lord of the
Right.
Rings fans, not any other fan, really, and ask them, like, did you watch all of the first season or not? I mean, that's where you would start, I think, because it's tough to know. Like, one thing I'd say, because this is something else I got, like, just thinking about like other shows that you think of people like, oh, I binge watched this show in like 2 days, and it's like, okay, like I can think of shows like there's a show called Night Agent. It's like 8 episodes or something like that. It just recently came out from, I think it was Amazon actually that came out with it. Um, like very like interesting, captivating, and like I was like see the first episode, I'm like, man, I want to go back and watch the next one, you know. And the same thing for like the new like Jack Reacher's show that came out. I think that's very captivating and exciting to people as well. Um, and also like taking off what I heard somebody else say is that it's a different kind of like storytelling in a way. Like it's so easy to tell stories about white guy with gun, go out and just kick butt and like win the day and you know good guys and bad guys kind of a thing. Everybody's like, oh, yeah, this is fun to watch. Um, so I think so that just reaches a big audience automatically in a way, and then I think having a Lord of the Rings show, like I don't know how I like picked up that I thought that Amazon was going to just give this to like a very broad audience, and they weren't necessarily focusing on Lord of the Rings fans. That's kind of like why I started the podcast. Is because like, I was thinking, well, people who are going to watch the show, I'm thinking aren't really going to be fans. That's what I'm thinking. So like, they're probably going to want to learn more about Middle Earth. And hey, I can give you a podcast that isn't necessarily going to bore you to death, but we can still talk about things that are going to be related between the two, and you're going to want to like learn. You're going to be learning more, not just about like, oh, like this is wrong compared to what they did in the books, but also just like the idea of like what are the themes and like the worldview that would be driving the show.
Yeah.
So it does. So like looking back on it, I was like, yeah, woke does seem to be driving the show. I guess the thing is though, is like you title it Lord of the Rings of Power, and you kind of look for a general audience. I'm like, that's not really gonna work. There are people who like are Lord of the Rings fans who are gonna watch this, and there might be some fan that's like, I gotta see what this is like at least. So he watches it the whole way through, like you're saying earlier, and he might not even like it, but he's like, as a fan, he's like, I have to see how this is like gonna play out. I mean, there could be fans also who just go to watch it and think, like maybe it's like too slow, or maybe it's just like whatever it is. But I think the bigger thing is that for me, if I was watching it on my own without others, like just how slow it started out and that it wasn't captivating. I'm just thinking about shows today where it's like everybody like is watching a show that they want to like binge watch like immediately, and be watching like, oh, I like the next, yeah, when does it come out next? Okay, yeah, I'm gonna be available to watch that, or you know what I mean. Like if somebody goes back to the Rings of Power now after it's out, maybe they haven't seen any of it. Are they gonna watch it and then like be like, oh man, let's binge watch this thing? I I don't think they necessarily would be, but that's just um from my perspective of watching it once a week and it kind of being slow.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that I think I have this like sneaking suspicion that like a lot of people who stuck out and watched the whole thing were like Lord of the Rings fans from either Peter Jackson's film trilogy or the books, who were like, hey, I this might get good. There's a chance, right? Or that they really love these characters. I think that a lot of those people were probably casual viewers who didn't actually like, who just weren't that invested in the show, right? And so they just left the show. I think the sort of scary part, maybe for season two, is that I don't think a lot of people who I think a good number of that 37% who did finish the first season won't bother jumping on the second season at all. Um,
Right.
and I think that's like because a lot of fans I think were really disappointed with the series. And it was interesting to read in one of the articles as well that like the show creators were like, oh, first season might have been a little bit slow, but we were setting up a lot of stuff. Second season will run a lot smoother. And my reaction when I was read that was like, they took the whole season to set up the making of the Rings of Power, which it seems like they did. They made at least the three Elven rings, some of the most important ones. They like revealed Sauron, and they also like got Numenor in there. Like there was so much time, and they spent it all like they already paid off a lot of their setup, in terms of revealing Sauron, the Rings of Power, stuff like that. That like I don't know. I don't have like a lot of faith that the second season will be much better, or that there's still plot lines that need resolved. I think they like besides Halbrand escaping and like maybe fighting Adar and Mordor, I don't think there's like a lot that needs resolved, right? Like, um,
That's a good point.
and so I think also for like that's also not looking super great for season two. Um,
Yeah, and if thinking about season two also in like some other terms that I didn't like dig deep into like some of the interviews from the cast members and the producers until like recently, and those were like those happened back around the time that the show is actually like coming out every week. So figuring out more of their like kind of woke agenda um, with things, then I realized okay, I was kind of anticipating, oh, maybe the producers will see that like there's not as like much of they didn't make as popular a show for the first season. Maybe they'll make it better for the second one. That was my original thought, but now seeing that like if there's more of a woke agenda behind everything, I don't really see them improving that storyline or storytelling because of it. But
yeah,
yeah,
I mean it's hard because they've already like I said they've paid off a lot of stuff, but also they very much set themselves in stone. Like we know what Sauron is going to be like. Like we have our characters sort of laid out and the way they're going to be, and so like even if they wanted to make big changes, they can't really. Yeah,
hmm,
I think it's hard. And it's difficult for me because like I don't know, I don't really know a whole lot about woke or this or woke that, but like yeah,
right.
they just it
I
seems
got
like
you.
they haven't told as good a story as they could have
Hmm.
with the material, right? Like Tolkien's works are some of the best, and they made big changes, and those changes did not pay off. I think it's interesting because like I was listening to another author who was talking about how he wanted his works adapted to film, and he was saying that like, oh, I always like I want them to feel free to adapt a lot of stuff because filmmaking is very different than book writing, and that was really interesting to me because I've always felt that like anytime I watched a work that my problem with it has always been that it's adapted too much rather than it's adapted too little. That like hey, if they had stuck closer to the original story for Rings of Power, then maybe I would be like, hey, like you stuck with it too closely, and like it doesn't look great on the screen or something. But the fact that they've adapted so much, they sort of don't have a leg to fall on in terms of like, hey, we were sort of hampered by our original source material. Like you really took a lot of liberties, so it's sort of your own fault for where you ended up, right? I guess is what I'm saying.
No, yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. Um, I haven't really thought about it much in terms of like how much they've already focused on so far, and because kind of like a good cliffhanger would have been almost to hey this to almost like kind of give a revealing of Sauron, but not at the end of the show at the end of the
Right.
season, and then that would leave people a little more like oh man, then I gotta watch the second season now. Because now it's like, all right, Measure saying like, what do we expect? Like, what are we trying to like expect to happen now?
The forging of the
Yeah,
One Ring is the one, right? But like the whole show built up to like this really short scene at the end about forging the rings of power, right? And it was just like really quick. So there's not like this like oh they're like building a slow build up, and there's not like a overarching story other than like maybe Sauron is going to be worried. We know Sauron's going to fight people, but that's like sort of it, right? There's not like I don't know. I thought they drag out the making of the rings a lot longer, and a lot of other storylines a lot longer.
mm-hmm.
But it seems like they very much rushed things at the end of season one.
Yeah. I mean, they can. It's not like they've made all of them yet, so
No, yeah,
that
but
is
it's interesting because the most powerful ones are the Elven rings, aside from the One Ring, and so it's like,
right.
will we even get to see the other ones made? Will they just be made off screen? Like, right, like
Hmm.
I don't think it will really carry the drama to have the Seven Rings and the Nine Rings made as well.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, that'd be interesting because I mean they still have like a lot to go off of, right? Because they can make the rings for the men and then for the dwarves and um
and how everybody ends up with their ring specifically is important as
yeah.
well, right? But
And it's interesting in that sense too, as though the way they ended it, that people who were watching would already know. Okay, well, we know there are more rings to be forged, so let's get ready for season 2. But yeah,
Yeah. But it'll be interesting to see how much hype the show gets around season 2, and if a lot of people do come back to the show. Maybe I'm wrong.
thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. Consider supporting my movement on Facebook, keeping the rings of power pure.